Hey, it's Dr. Asatar Bear, and today we're going to be talking about consumption and the spending multiplier. So, this is a topic from Keynesian economics, comes from this fellow right here, John Maynard Keynes, who wrote in the 1930s during the Great Depression. And this part of the Keynesian theory is about the theory of consumption. So, the argument here, what Keynes argues, is that as long as the economy is below its full employment output level, changes in total spending, that is aggregate demand, drive changes in GDP, which lead to growth or recession. And obviously, our concern, during a recession, like the Great Depression of the 1930s, is growth, getting growth going again. All right, so here we have our aggregate demand expression. Okay, here's AD, and this equals these different variables. We've talked about these before. Okay, consumption, investment, government spending, exports, imports. So consumption is the largest single part of total spending. It's about 65 to 70% of US GDP. What we do in Keynesian theory is we go through and explore each one of these. Okay, so this show is going to be focused on consumption, right? We also have a theory of investment. Okay, we've got stuff to say about government spending, that is fiscal policy. Most of the time, the exports and imports part is not part of the introductory macroeconomics, but is part of a more advanced course later on international trade, for example. So we're not going to be talking about a whole lot about exports and imports in this course. We'll touch on it. So to understand spending and income, we need to define some terms. All right, so let's look at, here's Y stands for total national income. All right, T stands for taxes, C stands for consumption, like we talked about, and S for savings. Okay, so we'll define disposable income, DI, as Y minus T. All right, and we also will define it as C plus S. Okay, consumption plus savings. Okay, so when people get more income, they spend part of it and save part of it, right? So again, disposable income, DI, is equal to C plus S, okay? So that's consumption plus savings. Now, the portion that people spend of their new income is called the marginal propensity to consume, or the MPC. So we get to the MPC by saying, okay, look, if there's a change in disposable income, delta DI, that's a change in consumption and a change in savings. So the question is, how much does consumption change given a certain change in disposable income? Okay, marginal propensity to consume then is the change in consumption over the change in disposable income. The portion that people save of their new income is the marginal propensity to save, okay, the MPS, and that's defined as delta S over delta DI, okay, MPS. It's also equal to simply 1 minus the MPC. So by identity, MPS plus MPC always equal 1. All right, so let's say this happened. Okay, you got an extra $100 and you spent $80 of it. And let's say that this was true not just for you, but for everyone in the economy, right? We're interested in what happens macroeconomically. So the question is, what is the marginal propensity to consume? The way we're going to get that is to take 80 and divide by the 100, all right? And of course, when we do that, we get 0.8. Okay, the marginal propensity to save is going to be simply 1 minus that. We do that and we get 0.2. Now, even if your income is 0, you will still spend some money, all right? This is called autonomous consumption, meaning, it's not really driven by income, okay? So we call it little a. So we can now write the consumption function, all right? And the consumption function is going to look like this in general, okay? C equals little a plus the MPC times DI, all right? Now remember, this DI term right here, this isn't two things. It's not D times I, it's one thing just called DI, all right? Same thing with the MPC. That's not three different terms. That's one term, all right? So if we put in some numbers for this, right, like we had said before, okay, let's say that the MPC is 0.8, and let's say that little a is 100. So then we would have C equals 100 plus 0.8 DI. All right, and the next thing we do is to create a graph of this function. Okay, so we've got consumption here on the vertical axis. We've got disposable income down on the horizontal axis. And we're going to, our function again is 100 plus 0.8 di. Okay, so that means it's going to have a vertical intercept here at 100, and it has a slope of 0.8. And it means that when we graph it, we're going to consider it relative to this 45-degree line. Okay, so now we're going to talk about this later on, right? But here's the thing, okay? We're structuring our scale so that the same distance on the vertical axis, that's 500 in this case, right, is the same distance here, indicates 500. And that means that a 45-degree line is all of the points of equality, all right, where C and DI are equal. And what this means for us later on when we develop the whole aggregate expenditure model, we're very interested in this position where the total spending is equal to the total income in society. All right, so that's the meaning of the 45-degree line. Okay, so let's say we were over here on the graph, right? We can see that the consumption line is above the income line, right? That means that this whole area in here is considered dis-savings, right? If consumption is greater than income in the whole economy, then what's happening is dis-savings is occurring. The only way that consumption can be greater than income is if there was debt accumulated, if people were running down their assets. And the only way that can happen in the entire economy is for inventories to be depleted, for wealth to be sold, etc. All right, so that is not considered an equilibrium position, okay, because that can only last so long, right? What's equilibrium in this economy is where consumption equals disposable income. Okay, similarly, if we go to the other side of it, the 45-degree line, meaning disposable income, is above the consumption line. This would only occur if people were spending less than the income, okay? So what that means in the whole economy, savings is occurring, macroeconomically, savings is occurring. And that means inventories are piling up. Again, not sustainable. Okay, so this is going to make more sense when we develop the entire model. Okay, but for now, let's just keep in mind, right? Over here would be savings. Over here would be dis-savings. We're mostly interested in graphing the consumption function. It's a simple linear expression. And we can see that it has a y-intercept at 100 in this case, and a slope equal to the marginal propensity to consume. It's equal to 0.8 here. Shifts in consumption can be caused by three different factors. All right, so example, we could have a change in wealth. Okay, this is also known as the wealth effect. And the wealth effect is a psychological reality, right? So Keynes focused a lot on the psychology of consumers. He said this has nothing to do with your income, because your income is how much you make per week or per year or whatever it is, right? Per month, whatever that is, that's income. Wealth is different, right? Wealth is the value of what you own. It's the value of your assets. Okay, so to take one example, let's say there's a real estate boom and home prices go up. Now, home prices, that's the most expensive thing that a typical person owns. So if their home price goes up, now let's say their income hasn't changed, right? If your home price goes up, your income hasn't changed, well, it's hard to see, like, how does that mean you spend more money, right? You still have the same amount of income, right? But here's the thing, right? If the value of your assets goes up, this is the wealth effect, you feel better. It makes you feel good, and that makes you feel better about spending. Okay, so macroeconomically, this positive psychology, okay, Keynes at other times calls it simply expectations. Okay, so 1 and 2 are similar. 1 is specifically related to changes in the value of wealth. 2 is any kind of positive expectation or negative expectation. These things shift consumption. All right. Let's do a negative example. Okay, back to the wealth effect. So the one that Keynes referred to, of course, is the stock market crash of 1929. Right. This is, we're all moving the opposite direction. Right. That is, the total amount of wealth falls. And this makes people feel a lot worse psychologically, okay? It starts to create negative expectations. Okay, the final thing is changes in the price level, right? So changes in the price level, let's say that inflation is expected to increase Well, people may buy more now, right? Depending on what they, again, what they expect about the future with regard to the price level. All right, so here's a graph which indicates what does it look like when the consumption function shifts. Okay, so look at what's happening here, right? The old consumption function, C1, is this darker olive colored line, right? And the new one, C2, is this lighter line, okay? So what's happened here is the consumption function has shifted up vertically, okay? And we can see that just by looking at the intercept there, the amount of that vertical shift is 80, okay? So like I put in this box, all right? Vertical shift is 80. Now, look, just because of the geometry of the lines, we are going to have a very different new equilibrium position, right? The old equilibrium position was at 500 and 500, okay? So disposable income, 500, let's say that's in billions of dollars. Consumption, 500 billion dollars, all right? Because the consumption function is upward sloping, right? It means that if there's a vertical shift in it, that's going to translate into a much larger change, right? See, the vertical shift here is 80, but look at this, right? The equilibrium value is much higher than that, okay? So your question is, well, what's the new equilibrium, right? How do we figure that out? All right, so Keynes' focus is on the mass psychology of the consumer, right? He is assuming that consumers' choices are not always strictly rational, right? But instead, they're driven by emotions, changes in the overall mood. This is what Keynes meant when he talked about expectations, right? Expectations means, what people expect to happen, their view of the future. But Keynes is giving that a very different interpretation. He's saying people are a lot less rational than economic theory had thought, right? They're a lot more driven by their emotions, and also by what everyone else is doing, right? So this is why we use the term mass psychology to describe this, right? And we would say, like, Keynes is a much more of a structuralist, okay? So a structuralist is focusing on how are individuals shaped by society, right? The opposite of that would be individualism. Economic theory was strongly individualist before Keynes, right? Individualism focuses on how individuals shape society, okay? So, and Keynes is not really focusing on that, right, in the general theory. His focus is on how society shapes individual behavior. So this is another big change to economic theory that Keynes introduces. So the big question here is, how does a change in spending affect the economy? Spending by one person is income to another person, which is then spent. And this is a chain which potentially goes on forever. So let's examine this, okay? Let's use a graph. And we'll say, okay, there's these different people in the economy down here, right? And if one person gets more money, let's say $100, well, then what happens, right? So look at this. One person gets that $100, okay? That's this person, person one over here. And that becomes income then to somebody else, okay? Let's say that this person one hires somebody, spends $100 on, piano lessons or something like that, right? So then person two gets $100 in income, which they then spend, okay? So look at this, right? 0.8 of it, that's the marginal propensity to consume. That's why it's 0.8. Okay, so 0.8 times 100 gives us 80, all right? And that's what person two is spending, okay? And then we say, well, how does this affect person three, right? So let's say that person two spends $80, they need their door fixed, they hire a handyman. Okay, so that's person three, okay? Person three is a handyman. So what has person two done with the rest of that money, right? They got $80, but they spent 64 of it, right? Or I'm sorry, they got $100, they spent 80 of it. What did they do with the rest of it? Well, the rest of it they saved, okay? So you spend $80 on this handyman, right? And then that person spends 0.8 of it, okay? Which is $64, okay? 80 times 0.8, $64. And so forth, right? 0.8 times 0.8 times 0.8. This potentially goes on forever, right? the economy never ends, right? Spending continues to circulate. But look at what's happening here, right? When we add up all of these things, we've got 100 now, plus 80, plus 64, plus 5120, plus 4096, on and on, but it's getting smaller each time, right? This is going to add up to more than $100, all right? And that's the whole thing that we're trying to understand here, is that how spending gets multiplied as it works its way through the economy. So we have this term called the spending multiplier, okay? And this is what this means, right? It's a formula which adds up all of this spending, because we don't have the time to add up an infinitely long chain of different things, but luckily people have figured this out for us, right? They said, look, this adds up to something that's equal to 1 over 1 minus the MPC, or 1 over the MPS. All right, and that is the formula for the spending multiplier. Okay, so we are going to take 1 over the MPS, and that gives us our spending multiplier. For example, okay, let's say the MPC is 0.8. That means the MPS is 0.2, and we're going to go 1 over that MPS. That's 1 over 0.2 to give us 5. All right. Let's deal with the interpretation, okay? If the spending multiplier is 5, what that means is the total change in GDP will be 5 times the increase in spending, all right? And that increase in spending could be any of these things, okay? It could be consumption, it could be government spending, it could be investment, it could be exports. It's not going to be an increase in imports, though, because imports is negative, all right? So just to go a little bit further with this, right? This means that a $1 in new spending leads to $5 in economic growth. Okay, that's the implication of the multiplier. All right. So $1 in new spending leads to $5 in new economic growth. And this works equally well in both directions. If spending was to decrease, then the GDP will decrease 5 times that amount, right? Again, negative $1 leads to negative $5. Okay, so let's talk about the fiscal policy implications. All right, so what fiscal policy refers to is, fiscal policy means government spending, what the government does in terms of spending and taxation. All right, so if we're interested in this question, what can the government do to increase spending? Well, there's a couple of classic things, right? If we want to have an impact on consumption, very simple. Okay, we can do tax cuts. So we want to change people's disposable income. We can raise consumption if we do that. Okay, we can simply cut their taxes. Okay, or we could increase government spending. Right, that's change G. Okay, so in terms of our equations, delta GDP. What does that mean? Right. Well, that means the change in GDP. Okay, what's the amount of economic growth, or if it's negative, contraction, that we're causing here. Okay, so very simple formula, right? Delta C, the change in consumption, times the spending multiplier, okay? And if it's a change in government spending, same thing, okay? We would so delta GDP equals delta G times the spending multiplier. Now, the marginal propensity to consume differs by income level, okay? So what we mean by that is, look, the poor have a higher marginal propensity to consume than do the rich. Right? So what does that mean? Higher marginal propensity to consume. Why would they have a higher marginal propensity to consume? Well, here's the thing, right? If you're poor, every dollar of your income is pretty much spoken for, right? Like you might, it's very easy to fall behind on your bills and so on. If you get an extra dollar, you're probably going to spend all of that dollar, right? You have to. You're living very close to the bone, right? The rich have more options. They don't need to spend everything that they take in. They might want to, but maybe not, right? On average, the marginal propensity to consume is going to be lower, and we know that the rich save far more than the poor do. They're simply able to, right? So for this reason, if we're talking about fiscal policy, if we're talking about something like tax cuts or other policies that are designed to affect spending or to raise incomes, they're going to be most effective if they're directed toward the poor. All right, and some Keynesians have been are very clear on this, right? So that, listen, if we're going to cut taxes, that's the group that we should target. For the first thing is it's going to be more effective, okay? The second thing is it's also going to reduce economic inequality, right? So the gap between rich and poor, if we raise the fortunes of the poor, that's going to make a more equal society, okay? All right, in the United States, the overall marginal propensity to consume is about 0.97, okay? And that means that the marginal propensity to save is about 0.03, okay? And now this would imply that the spending multiplier is about 33 and a third, right? And that is a lot higher than the multiplier probably is, okay? So, we have this problem with all of economic theory, which is it's very hard for us to hold everything else constant, right? The ceteris paribus assumption is hardly ever met. But the mathematical multiplier in this situation is much higher. Okay, so how did I get this? I took 1 and divided by this 0.03. Okay, do that yourself just to convince yourself that that's where that this is correct. Okay, so in more advanced Keynesian economics, they use a more complicated multiplier to try to take account of these different leakages, and that'll give you a lower multiplier, right? Because the reality is that empirical studies have found that the spending multiplier is somewhere between 1 and 2, right? So even though, it seems like it should be a lot higher if we just look at the raw number like in the United States, right? What we find is the multiplier is actually a lot lower than that. Keynes is aware of this, right? Lots of economists, Keynesian economists are well aware of this. And so that's why they use a more complex multiplier, right? So the next step in this process, what we're going to do after this is we're going to talk about the theory of investment. Okay, we're going to add I to this model. And we're going to talk about fiscal policy. We're going to add G to the model. And then we're going to talk a little bit about exports and imports, not a whole lot, right? So we're adding all of the different pieces to total spending or aggregate demand, and that's going to give us the aggregate expenditure model. All right, but that's the end of my lecture for today. Thank you very much.